Hi, welcome to Jacky Rom Investigates. And yes, I am Jacky Rom. And I've had the best time over the last few weeks chatting to all different people around the world, ordinary people with extraordinary lives, and just finding out all about them. And maybe they'd end up as a character in a book. I've also learned some new skills. Makeup, well, they're not new, but makeup, hair, costume, lighting, directing, editing. It's been amazing. Let's go over and see who the guest is today. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm good, Jackie. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. What time is it for you at the moment?
It is 10 o'clock in the morning in West Hollywood, California.
And it's 6 o'clock in the evening in the UK.
So how did the day go? I guess it went okay.
It was good. We've got some nice weather. Not as good as your weather, though.
Yeah, it's gorgeous today.
Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind, could you tell my viewers a little bit about what you do?
Sure. My name's John Duran. I'm a native Angelino. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I am an attorney. That's my day job, and a city councilman and past mayor of the city of West Hollywood for the past 20 years. I got my start as an attorney when I thought I was going to become a corporate lawyer. And then the AIDS epidemic hit Southern California, and I suddenly found myself becoming a lawyer for a lot of lawbreakers. I was the attorney for ACT UP Los Angeles, which was the direct action group that was protesting government indifference and representing them at demonstrations and protests. And then I became the lawyer for the Needles Now, which was a needle exchange where volunteers were passing out clean needles to drug addicts to help prevent the spread of HIV. Of course, it's illegal to possess, at that time, a syringe without a medical prescription. And then I became the attorney for medical marijuana when we realized that marijuana helped alleviate pain, helped people keep their medication down, helped deal with the nausea. But again, marijuana was illegal in California, and possessing it in large quantities, as these buyers clubs were doing, was also illegal. So I started to become this HIV and AIDS lawyer. And then that led in the 90s to becoming an LGBT rights lawyer. And then that led to me getting elected to public office in 2001. And I've been on the West Hollywood City Council now for almost 20 years.
What a journey. Fantastic. Yeah. So grew up in Hollywood, West Hollywood, and the family, siblings and mum and dad at home, or?
Sure. I come from a lower middle class Latino family. I was actually born in East LA, over on the east side where most of the Mexican American community lives.
Where did your parents come from?
My parents actually moved to Los Angeles in the 1950s. Prior to that, they lived in a place called Silver City, New Mexico, which is in the southwestern part of the United States. And my family's roots go back hundreds of years in southwestern United States. And when people say, oh, when did your family cross the border? I say, no, your border crossed my family in 1849. We were always sitting there in the middle of the New Mexico desert, and one day we all became U.S. citizens.
And so did you know from very young what you wanted to do?
No, I didn't have a clue. I was a very creative kid. I read a lot of books. I didn't feel comfortable being around other kids. I wasn't really great at sports. I wasn't comfortable with large groups. And so I ended up isolating and just reading. And my entire world was contained in these books that I would buy 10 or 15 a month from a local book club. And I would read and read and read. And I created all these fantasy worlds. And I think that's something that a lot of people who feel different end up isolating and creating their own universes and worlds. And that's what I did. I was in Catholic school for 12 years. I have 2 little brothers and a little sister. And while they all seem to be doing just fine at getting along with others, I was mostly content with being by myself.
And at what point did you then decide I want to go into law?
I graduated from Cal State Long Beach with a degree in business. And I had a business degree. And then I thought, okay, maybe I need to get an MBA now and go for higher education. And I thought, well, everyone's going to get an MBA. I'll get a JD instead. And I thought
Well,
I was.
hold on, tell me what that is, because I've not heard of that.
Oh, sure. MBA is a Master's in Business
Yeah,
Administration, and a JD is a Juris Doctorate. It's a law degree.
right.
And I decided I would become a business lawyer, and that would be my higher education in getting a doctorate. And as I was graduating from law school, about the same time that that happened, HIV hit Southern California. And I suddenly discovered so many of my friends getting very sick and starting to die terrible deaths with horrific diseases. And I was a brand new, graduated law student taking the California bar and trying to find lawyers who would do the work that was needed. Back then, people were being fired because they were HIV positive, kicked out of their apartments, denied medical care. Restaurants wouldn't serve them. Doctors wouldn't treat them. Morticians wouldn't bury their bodies. There were all these terrible legal issues that were going on. And I kept thinking, well, there's got to be some lawyers doing this work. And I discovered no. The large law firms refused to handle cases for people with AIDS. And the smaller law firms didn't see any market in, doing those sort of services for people who were sick and dying. So I found three other young lawyers like myself. We all passed the bar that year. A lawyer from San Francisco named Joe Lokvam, a lawyer from Canada named Bruce Robertson, and a lawyer from New York named Tom Kendricks. And the four of us, we were all in our 20s, and we formed a small law firm to do the work of HIV and AIDS in Southern California. Sadly, both Bruce and Tom passed away in the epidemic, but Joel and I are still here.
Wow. It sounds like a film. Just the story sounds like it would transfer to the big screen.
Yeah, I've actually been writing something. Funny you should say that, because what happened then over the next 30 years, it sometimes seems surreal. One day I'm having dinner in the White House with the President of the United States, and then the next day I'm getting arrested in front of the White House with another President of the United States. And so all of this trauma around this social revolution that was happening around HIV and AIDS and LGBT rights, I just found myself in the right place at the right time. And I thank God above that I did not become a corporate lawyer. I think I would have been vastly unhappy worrying about bottom lines and profit margins. Instead, I got to do work that was meaningful, and made a difference. So I started writing it down.
Oh, good. Yeah, you need to write the book of your life.
Yeah, I met a young millennial about a year and a half ago, and I was telling him some of the stories, what I called the bad old days, the good old bad old days, because a lot of it's really trauma filled. And he said, you need to write all of this down. I said, I have to be honest, it's a very painful place for me to go sometimes, because some of those memories are still very fresh, and I miss. I lost 104 friends between 1985 and 1995. And he said, you know what? I am a gifted musician. You are a good speaker and writer. Let's write a musical play about this. And I've discovered by writing it that way, it feels like I'm talking about somebody else's life, and I'm able to get it on paper.
That's fantastic, because people need to know that there are good people around. And I think that's important, especially in today's world where we've kind of forgotten the previous battles. With today's battles. You forget the last battle.
Yeah, no, so true. I actually put together a Zoom call earlier this week with 7 of us that were in the trenches during the last epidemic in the 80s. Dr. Michael Gottlieb, who's one of the co-discoverers of the HIV virus. He was the first physician to put all the pieces of the puzzle together in 1981 and figured out that there was a new virus among us. He's become a very dear friend. A lawyer named Diane Abbott, and she became the first chair of AIDS Project Los Angeles. A rabbi named Denise Eger, who was a clergy member who was, dealing with all the death and dying within not only her congregation, her synagogue, but also all around the community. David Kessler, who was a nurse and created progressive nursing, because back then nurses wouldn't treat HIV patients. So he had to go out and find nurses that were willing to get into the middle of the epidemic. A journalist named Karen Oakham, and an African American activist named Phil Wilson, who created the Black AIDS Institute here in Los Angeles. And the seven of us have all known each other almost 40 years, and we decided to get together and talk about our experiences and what happened in the 80s and 90s and why it's valuable information for people today. Good 90-minute call. It was awesome.
Yeah, I bet. AIDS epidemic has been mentioned numerous times over the last couple of months.
Right. Yeah.
And they're comparing numbers. That's what they're doing a lot, is comparing numbers of deaths then to now.
You know, that's good to do the quantitative analysis. I wish more of the media would do the qualitative, because one of the things that we had to learn to do was how to live with a virus in our midst. HIV hasn't disappeared. It's been here 40 years. And as we were doing the body counts and losing people, at the same time, we had to create new institutions and new facilities and create new research and new advancements in medication and treatment. And we did all that, and not that we knew how. We didn't know how. We just dove in. And so a lot of times I look back, and what I'm seeing now in the last 3 months reminds me of the early years of the AIDS epidemic, until people finally got angry enough to take matters into their own hands. And that's where I feel we are, at least right now in my country. We have a government that's not only neglectful, but willfully ignorant and reckless with the lives of people. We're now at 100,000 deaths, more than anywhere else in the world. And it's all out of indifference and neglect. And this is the exact same scenario we saw in the early days of the AIDS epidemic.
Really? It's a repeat?
It is a repeat.
You know, isn't it sad? Because you think people should learn from times and not repeat.
Yeah, and you know, I think part of it too is, at least here in the United States, you know, we lost 500,000 people to AIDS in the 80s and 90s, many of them gay men. But a lot of the people who survived that period of time, I think, are walking around with some PTSD. It was not normal for young 20-year-olds to lose their entire circle of friends. You know, that's something that people experience in times of war. You know, I think about the bombing of London and what people in London must have felt like during World War II, and how they survived that and came through it. And that's what I feel the survivors of the last epidemic are. We're kind of the walking wounded, walking around.
I was going to say, how have you survived? Is work your survival?
I was very fortunate. I'm pretty open about this, but I bottomed out as an alcoholic and a drug addict in the mid-90s. You know, I was self-medicating with alcohol and drugs for a long period of time. That's, I think, the way a 20-year-old thinks about how to manage problems. Let me just get stoned or high, right?
Yep.
And it ended up, you know, in a very bad spot. And I had to walk into a 12-step meeting in the middle of the 90s. And I've been there ever since. And even though I had a lot of religious training in my 12 years of Catholic school, I hadn't thought much about spirituality or about those notions, those virtues around spirituality. And I found that in my 12-step meetings. And that's helped ground me a great deal through the work I did around HIV, AIDS, LGBT rights, and even today as an elected official here in Los Angeles.
So you work still in law, and
I'm a criminal defense lawyer now.
How exciting!
Now I'm talking your language, I know.
Yes. So are courts closed at the moment?
Yes. All the courts are closed, and they're really not operating other than emergency situations. And we're going to have an incredible backlog of cases whenever the courts reopen. But for now, because of social distancing, most government buildings are still closed.
And the other job you have in the city, what's that job that you do?
I'm a city councillor, and there are 5 of us on the city council, and we have a rotating mayor system. So each of us takes his or her turn being mayor once a year. I've been on the council coming up on 20 years, and I've served as the mayor of West Hollywood 4 separate times. If I get reelected later this year, then I'll be mayor for a 5th time, and then after the next term, that's it.
Okay. So
23 years is long enough.
in England, a mayor is a celebrity. There's no powers. He just cuts ribbon and raises money. A mayor does nothing else. So tell me what the duties of a mayor in America, because they're very different from here. They're not elected. Well, they are elected by councillors, but they just literally open shops and things like that.
Yeah, it depends on the city. Like the larger cities that have a city, what's called a city charter, like the city of Los Angeles, the city of New York, the city of Chicago, the people elect the mayor directly, and the mayor has actually some extraordinary powers to veto budget, to make appointments, to make executive orders without the legislative body or the city council necessarily being involved. In the smaller cities, my city is considered a smaller city. We're a general law city. So people elect the 5 councillors, and then we just pass the gavel around. And in my city, our mayor does the same thing that sounds like Boris Johnson does, which is cut the ribbons and show up and issue proclamations and run the meetings. It's more administrative than anything.
And do you have a Pride? Do you have a LA Pride Day out there or anything like that?
We do actually. All right. So the history of Pride. This is the 50-year anniversary of Pride. Yes. City of West Hollywood, right? In 1969, the Stonewall riots happened in New York City. Strangely, we had riots here in Los Angeles in '67, 2 years before that at the Black Cat Tavern. But that didn't make the national news like the New York riots. But I always attribute the Black Cat Tavern as being the beginning of the movement rather than Stonewall in '69. But a year later in 1970, the Reverend Troy Perry, Morris Kite, and others decided to have a parade in order to commemorate what happened in New York on Christopher Street. And so they created something called Christopher Street West, which happened only 1 year on Hollywood Boulevard in 1970. The LAPD harassed the people in the parade. The city government attempted to not let the parade go forth. They had to be taken to court. It was a complete hassle. So the year after that, '71, it came to West Hollywood, my city, and it's been here ever since. So every year we have a parade and a festival, and normally we get 300,000 people to show up for that. So it's an extraordinary event in our city. Not happening this year.
When does it normally happen?
It usually happens the second or third weekend of June. So it's coming up in a few weeks, and it's all going to be online. And instead, we're doing a lot of talking heads and art pieces and other cultural events online for people to participate. But we hope to be back on the streets next year. I guess it all depends on the COVID virus.
Oh, please God, I hope so. So have you got any goals and things that you haven't done that you want to do?
I think, yes. So, money is not a real big motivator for me, and neither is power, and neither is politics. And it's funny to say because I've been doing politics for 40 years of my life. But that little kid that I told you about at the beginning of the interview used to read books. I used to write plays, and I'd get the neighborhood kids to audition, and I'm like 10 years old, and we create pieces of art, and I charge a nickel for people to come watch our show and sell them lemonade, and I liked doing that. But I stopped doing that because I thought it was an identifier that called me out for being gay. And then I was subjected to bullying and harassment. And so all the creative sides of me, I shut them down to protect myself from violence. And I think a lot of LGBT people do that. We create the closets that we shelter in, and we try to do away with any of the things that make us unique. So part of coming out for me, and I think for countless others, has been about reclaiming that which came so naturally to us as children. And what came naturally to me was being creative and writing fantastic stories. And so I'm working on a couple of projects right now, one about the history of the LGBT movement in Los Angeles and the AIDS epidemic and why it's relative to COVID. And the other is I'm working with a fellow on the House of Usher, Edgar Allan Poe's The House of Usher, Fall of the House of Usher, redoing it in musical format for a Halloween tale for high school kids in Los Angeles to enjoy the work of Edgar Allan Poe, because young people, they don't get the classics anymore. They get everything on, the internet or by tweet or Instagram or selfie, and they're missing out on Edgar Allan Poe and Lewis Carroll and all the great classics, and it's a shame. So
Yeah.
I'm going to spend my time bringing that back to life.
Brilliant. I'm a drama teacher. That's my other job.
Oh, great.
So I do a lot of Shakespeare with the children. Any classics. I agree. Classics are very, very important. How old were you when you came out publicly?
18.
And was that a hard decision to do, or were you ready? And how did your parents take it?
It was very hard. Here in the state of California, it was criminal to be gay or lesbian up until the year 1975. So I turned 18 in 1978. It was just a few years after that. I knew I was having these homosexual feelings, and I thought, oh my God, I've got to get away from the city. It's Los Angeles is corrupting me. That's what it is. I need to go somewhere decent and healthy and wholesome where I can save my immortal soul. I'm going to go work at Disneyland, because all the kids there seem to be so clean cut and all wholesome. And I went and I got a job there working at Disneyland. I did not realize I had just thrown myself into the hotbed of homosexuality, because all the people who worked there were also gay and lesbian. And so I ended up finding my tribe of people, and I did save my soul at Disneyland, just not the way I intended.
Brilliant. And how were your parents? Were they supportive?
Yes, my mother has passed now. She passed a few years ago, but obviously being very, Catholic and very Latino, they had learned a lot of things about homosexuality from the church. And so when I first told my mother, it was awkward, and she said, "Don't tell your dad," because my dad is a retired United States Marine and very conservative, a Korean War veteran. And she said she would tell him, and she kind of fumbled it. She didn't do it very well. But they started to meet my friends, and a lot of their ideas about gay men and lesbians were suddenly called into question, because it wasn't like they suspected at all. And she ended up becoming a founding member of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays in East Los Angeles. And whenever Latina mothers, had their kids come out, they would all say, "Oh, go talk to Gloria Duran. Her son's been out since the 70s. He's been out forever." And so they go talk to her, and they'd say, "Gloria, weren't you upset when John told you he was gay?" And she said, "For a little while, yes, but I was more upset when his brother Tony told me he was a Republican." That.
That's so funny.
Yeah, she was an elected official also. She was in public office on the school board here in Los Angeles for 16 years. So in many ways, she was somebody I looked up to, and a mentor, and in whose path I followed. So.
When we first opened this, I noticed the painting behind you and asked you straight away. Tell everybody again, because it's fabulous.
This is a great painting. My friend Robert Ivers painted it for me. He was a very talented artist here in Los Angeles, and sadly, we lost him in the AIDS epidemic in the late 80s. And while he was sick and getting sicker, he wanted to give me something to remember him by. So I've had this painting on my wall now for 30 years, and it's nice that you asked me so I can remember Robert now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been fascinating chatting. I've really enjoyed hearing your story, and I'm really interested to see when you get books, play, whatever you decide to do. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm really excited. The name of the work is called Wildfire, because wildfire is something Southern Californians are accustomed in terms of a natural disaster. It happens every year. It spreads rapidly. It's indiscriminate. It strikes down rich or poor. Sometimes it hits one house, skips over three, hits another house, and it seems to have a mind of its own. And that's what the AIDS epidemic felt like in Southern California in those days, like a wildfire blazing across the land. But what Act Two of the production is about is that the people who respond to it, we become the new wildfire. We burn down the institutions and the religious beliefs and the governments who do not respond to pandemic well and create new systems. And so wildfire becomes a metaphor for the human response in the midst of a pandemic. And so I finished writing it. I've run it by a couple of critics. They've given me some great suggestions. I'm doing my first rewrite. Hope to have it launched next year.
Oh, I think it's going to do really well. I think that it's good to keep memories alive. I think it's good to move forward, like I think we are doing. I hope we're doing. We're all far more tolerant.
Right. I think that's right. And I think there were lessons that the women and men who responded to AIDS learned that would be really helpful to the world pandemic now. You know, when AIDS happened to a lot of people, it was not just something that happened to other people. It didn't seem to affect me personally. But to those of us in the middle of it that were losing dozens of people every month, our whole world was falling apart. And that's what I think the world is experiencing now, the world falling apart. Feels like everything, all future plans, all economies, all dreams are falling apart. We felt that too. And yet we came through, and we even came through stronger. And so I think there's wisdom to be taken from the women and men who walk through that all over the world. And hopefully it'll be useful to all of us as we move forward through COVID-19.
I'm not going to add anything. It was lovely. That was a lovely ending to our interview. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.